Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending another in the series of brown bag webinars from EarthShift Global. I want to first thank everyone for attending today and for bearing with us a little bit as we've had to go through a little bit of hoops to accommodate the larger than expected audience that we ended up for today's session. Really excited about today's session. Just to kick it off, my name is Jim Loughran here at EarthShift Global. I'll be acting as the moderator for today's discussion, and we'll be walking through a couple of use cases and a series of discussions around what is S-ROI and what's the business case for it. And we'll have a great panel of speakers. Unfortunately, Lydia Berger will not be able to join us today. She's had an emergency that's pulled her away, which is unfortunate, but Stefan will be covering her content a little bit and putting in a little bit of a teaser to maybe bring her back into his session, which is coming up here next month. So with that, a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If anyone has any technical challenges, can't hear, things of that nature, go ahead and use the chat window, which should be on the lower right of your screen, to chat with Sam and let Sam know that you're having some challenges, and he should be able to help you resolve those quickly. And we're going to try to make this as interactive as we can today, and as part of that, you can ask questions, and we're hoping you ask questions. And so for the questions, if you, again, using the chat window, if you go ahead and select send question to staff, that will go ahead and send the question in to me, and at the end, we're going to leave at least 10 to 15 minutes for an open Q&A that we can hopefully get all of your questions asked as well. And lastly, I just want to make sure everyone knows or is aware that we're recording this session, and the session will be available to you and to any of your colleagues that couldn't attend today to go ahead and be able to view this at their leisure. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panel. So we've got Terry Robinson from Pratt & Whitney, who's sharing a great use case with us. Again, unfortunately, Lydia is not going to be able to join us. But Stefan is here from Impact Infrastructure. He'll be going through S-ROI from Impact Infrastructure's perspective. Oops, sorry about that. And lastly, we've got Lisa Lauren from EarthShift Global, who will be going through S-ROI as well. So I think we'll have some great background material to start, and then we'll be able to ask some questions as we go. So please, if you have questions, use that chat feature and send them those on through. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Stefan to get the discussion started. So you now have control, Stefan.
All right. Let's show my screen here. Can you just confirm that you can see it?
We can. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to move this little bar to the right here, and then I'll get a good view of the screen too. So the first slide here is really an introduction to what we mean by S-ROI. It's really best practice in triple bottom line and cost-benefit analysis. And the terminology really of sustainable return on investment is really a way to frame it as a unique best practice. That's really why we use the term, both EarthShift and ourselves. It really represents, risk analysis, life cycle cost analysis, cost benefit, triple bottom line, all those best features all wrapped into one as part of the process. So when we say triple bottom line, that's a pretty well-known term now, but really it means putting dollar values on environmental and social impacts. Cost benefit analysis, even more well-known, it's been around since the 1960s, really identifies who gains and who loses from society's perspective. It does express externalities in dollar terms as well. So you are doing a life cycle costing, looking at the true full cost of a project over its life cycle, but you're also including the environmental and social benefits over the life of the project. And so this diagram really illustrates that with your typical Venn diagram. And the idea is you take best available scientific and economic data about the environmental and social impacts and include it in your best practice life cycle cost analysis or revenue business case, and make sure that you incorporate all of the factors, including risks and uncertainties, into the decision-making process. Then you end up with two sets of results. You end up with your financial results, your real financial business case that hopefully is being done on most of these projects already, including things like revenue or cost savings or capital expenditures, replacement costs, operations and maintenance, all those kinds of things. You end up with a financial return, but you also end up with a return from society's perspective, or sustainable return on investment, which incorporates all these things in the blue boxes that you can see here in terms of valuing people's time, in terms of productivity, water quality or saving water quantity, recreational value, greenhouse gas. Of course, carbon is probably by far the largest environmental impact that's being tracked now. It's a lot of government and regulatory type agencies or rating agencies, GRESB and people like that, require tracking greenhouse gases. So that's one where, you know, we not only identify the impact in terms of number of tons, but put a dollar value on those tons as well. And I certainly know that from Impact Infrastructure's perspective, that's typically based on the interagency working group on the social cost of carbon value. So we put all dollar values and all these things and include it in the business case so that decision makers have a more holistic view of the true full costs and benefits of your project over the life of the project. And I do say project because one of the differences between Impact Infrastructure and EarthShift is we focus a little bit more on the project side. I think EarthShift focuses a little bit more on the policy side. Doesn't mean that neither of us don't do the other. It's just a little bit more of a focus, I think. In terms of another way of looking at things, especially in terms of a project, if you look here, you've got sort of the light green or blue-green boxes here that identify your typical benefits and typical costs when you're looking at a project. You discount for the time value of money over the life of the project, and you end up with a net present value typically at the end, or a benefit cost ratio, or internal rate of return, some other kind of output metric. But the difference when you're looking at the S-ROI is that you add the non-cash impacts in dollars into the total benefit category. You can also add some to cost, but for simplicity, this diagram shows them all in benefits. So cost as an example would be if your project increased carbon as opposed to reduced carbon as an example. So it's really adding that monetization of the non-cash impact that is the main focus of S-ROI. How do we get values for these things? Really we use third-party economic and scientific data. We don't really create much data on our own. We might use client-specific data, as in the willingness to pay for water quality in Puget Sound, as an example. But generally, we're using third-party economic and scientific data. How do economists come up with values? Well, here's an example of some of the methodologies they use. But willingness to pay is probably one of the easiest things to understand. It's what are people willing to pay to avoid, say, more polluted water, or to leave water in its natural state in streams, or to live closer to an amenity like a transit system. So that's probably one of the easier ones to understand. Where do we get these sources? I just mentioned, here's an example of a bunch of nice little logos of the kind of places where we do get this kind of data. Largely federal government data from US federal government, sometimes Canadian or even European sources as well are used. Now, what do results look like when you do an S-ROI analysis? This is a hypothetical one, and it looks like there's a lot of numbers on the screen. That's partly, it's not to confuse people listening in, it's actually to show that we do consider a lot of different factors. This is actually only a subset. But at the top there, you can see that in terms of environmental and social factors that we can monetize, obviously there's greenhouse gases, there's other types of pollutant, flood risk, change in property value, heat stress, mortality, and I'll let you read that list there. There are several more that we would potentially include in certain types of projects. The box below it is the financial return on investment numbers. So those are the real dollar impacts, things like capital costs and O&M and avoided real costs as an example. And then below it, you can see there's financial results and results from society's perspective, FROI and S-ROI results. And if you look at this sample, 3 hypothetical alternatives for whatever you would want to look at, you can see that alternative 1 has the best net social environmental impact. If you look right at the bottom under alternative 1, you can see it has a $53 million benefit from environmental and social impacts, the monetized value of environmental and social impacts, which are in the top box above. Now, the financial cost over the life of the project in this particular case was $15 million. So in real dollars, real cash on hand, let's say for the owner of the project, it would actually cost money over time. However, there would be an offsetting $53 million of benefits for a net sustainable S-ROI, net present value, of $38 million. And you can see that alternatives 2 and 3 offer less and less environmental and social benefits to the point where alternative 3 actually has negative environmental and social benefits. Net negative, it produces more carbon and reduces water quality. So you could almost look at from alternative 1 being the most sustainable project, alternative 3 being the least sustainable. And, once again, this is a hypothetical example, but I'll show some real world ones in a moment. So let's move on to some case studies. So this is a case study in Edmonton, Alberta. It's the redevelopment of a airport, and basically they built a suburban airport, so the city owns the downtown airport land, and they want to build the most sustainable neighborhood in the world, as many cities want to do. In their particular case, they've actually are extra motivated to get people to move up north, and there's lots of jobs and not enough population in the Edmonton area, so they're extra motivated to create a sustainable neighborhood. So what we did for them is we looked at a lot of different alternatives that would make the neighborhood more sustainable, and you can see this is a list of some of them: combined heat and power systems, photovoltaics, shallow geo-exchange. We looked at neighborhood level water reuse as an example. And by the way, the city did make decisions on thermal power and electrical power as well as water reuse based on our analysis. This result table here explains the results for one of those alternatives, which was combined heat and power. So this is a combined heat and power plant that would produce obviously heat and power. In this case, it's burning natural gas. You can see on the columns, you've got an FROI column and an S-ROI column. The top portion in green is the benefits. The middle to bottom is the costs from a present value perspective. And if you look right at the bottom, you can see the financial impact on its own would have been a $10 million net cost over the life of the project to the city. However, there was $81 million of environmental and social benefits, so that the S-ROI, the net triple bottom line benefit to society, was actually $71 million over the life of the project. The reason is because the electrical grid in Alberta is very dirty fossil fuel. So the fact that a combined heat and power system would have been a cleaner burning fuel, and that you would not lose the heat, you could actually use the heat in a district energy system, is the real benefit there. And the next slide shows, the results for a bunch of these different things we looked at. And as I mentioned, they actually chose a combination of combined heat and power, shallow geo-exchange, PV, and they decided not to go forward with the water, which is not actually on here, just because water is not scarce in Edmonton, so it has a lower social value. So that's an example on a city level. When we look at, now I'm actually moving into some of the slides that Lydia would have covered. I don't actually have her deck, but I created some slides to cover for her briefly and cover some of her area. So Lydia she's a VP at Dewberry, which is a large architecture firm. And we've done some work with them. I do want to specify here that even though all of her examples here are going to be architecture related, that S-ROI is obviously not just for architecture. And in fact, we do all kinds of projects, wastewater treatment plants, and pretty much anything under the sun. But these examples are all architecture. So this is a big hospital in Texas for the military. It's a Defense Health Agency hospital. And you can see this particular alternative. We looked at a whole bunch of alternatives for sustainability on the project, but this is an example of on-base wastewater reuse, not something the DoD normally does, but it's a simple example that drives home what we're trying to do. So if you look under the blue column here, you've got FROI, or financial return, $2.6 million on net present value, negative. It would have cost the Department of Defense an extra $2.6 million over the life of the project to clean and reuse their own water on the base instead of connecting to El Paso water and sewer. The breakdown on the right here identifies where we get the results on the left. The biggest benefit is the potable water savings in El Paso. And unlike Edmonton, which has no irrigation, small population, and the river that feeds it is 97% unallocated, so only 3% of the water is actually allocated. So water has a very low social value. El Paso is fed by a depleting aquifer, and water is extremely scarce and precious. So it had a high social value there. All of our results are generally location specific as well. So you can see that from society's perspective, it is actually better for the base to reuse their water instead of to further deplete the aquifer. So that's one of the Dewberry projects. A couple others here, I don't actually have results, I just have them listed as examples, and you'll have to stay tuned to the December 15th webinar to, hopefully we'll get Lydia onto that one to talk about things in more detail. But, and that one will be about our software called AutoCase, which I'll touch on in a second. But you can see these are a couple of different projects. One, we're looking at their headquarters, and another one is a project in Africa. But this headquarters project in particular, I want to emphasize because there's pretty interesting developments occurring for USGBC LEAD and ISI Envision. So the LEAD program has just approved a pilot credit for doing triple bottom line analysis, or essentially S-ROI analysis would get you an extra pilot credit for doing LEAD projects. And that Dewberry headquarters project is going to be getting that extra credit. Both LEAD and Envision have pretty much committed to adding economic analysis, which SRI qualifies for, to the point system for the next version of their rating system. So that's quite exciting, actually. So I mentioned the December 15th webinar. That's when I'm going to go into more detail specifically about the software that we have to do S-ROI analysis or triple bottom line analysis. It's called AutoCase. You can go to autocase.com to have a look, but I'll be covering that in more detail on December 15th. And I also just wanted to mention that, of course, EarthShift has their own software, 3 pillars, and they really use the same framework, but they are different, and you'll be able to see the differences between them. But as I mentioned earlier, AutoCase is a little bit more, or much more, project specific, whereas 3 pillars is more open-ended, ideal for policy as an example. But needless to say, there is some overlap, and they do use a similar framework. So I think it probably eats up my time here, and I'll pass it on to Lisa to continue on.
Great, thanks, Steph. That was great. It's good, good lead in here, and I'm glad you could cover off a little bit of Lydia's content as well. I think that's a nice thing to do. So with this, great. Lisa, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. I have to say that we've been working on S-ROI since 1999, in fact, and it's only been in the last year that we've come into connection with impact infrastructure, and what was really delightful is that we've been working parallel paths to develop the S-ROI methodology, but have really come out to the same conclusion. We're pretty much using the same methodology, just applying it just a tiny bit differently. As Steph said, they're doing a little bit more on the project side, and we're doing a little bit more toward the policy side. And I thought that I'd focus a little bit more on both government and corporate policy and the use of S-ROI for those purposes. I wanted to go through a little bit about how we do it. Again, the same as impact infrastructure, but this is This outline is more for when you're looking at a bigger decision, a policy decision, and perhaps those numbers aren't available in the literature. So we start off with defining a goal and scope. Just like any other assessment, without a goal and scope, you can dig yourself a data mine. And then we do the traditional return on investment analysis. Those traditional numbers are a great starting point to kick us off, and without that, you're kind of lost. We often do a life cycle assessment to bring in those broader environmental impacts. And you know, we can look at multiple alternatives, just like Steph said. We can look at the differences in the environmental impacts between projects and bring those in. The next thing we do is identify those stakeholders. Who is being affected by the decision, by the investment, by the project? That's really critical, and this starts to get us to where we can start to identify risks to different agents, different affected groups. This is where we go a little bit off the path of using literature values and start to actually talk to stakeholders. This is a little bit more intense, if you will, and Steph will tell you they do the same thing. You get those stakeholders involved, and get them talking. Now, when we do this with corporations, often we can't bring the actual stakeholders into the discussion. So what we'll do is we'll find representatives that within the company that can represent the external stakeholders. For example, if you've got a community that might be affected, we can bring in the PR person, the public relations person who is talking to the community all the time, and they can bring that perspective in. It's always better to bring the real stakeholders in, and we can talk a little bit about that too. But because we're trying to model a very extensive network and a supply chain, etc., we do have to streamline, or it will take forever. We then hold a workshop typically and bring those stakeholders in. We ask them again to identify stakeholders because sometimes they know of people who are affected by the decision that the core group of people internal to the organization they're not aware of. We have them then identify potential risks and opportunities for each of those stakeholder groups and identify for those risks and opportunities what is the probability that that's going to happen. And sometimes it's 100%, and sometimes it's 1%. But sometimes the costs that are associated with, or the benefits that are associated with those very small risks or opportunities can be really important. We then conduct the impact assessment and then do some interpretation and feedback to the decision-making loop. And the impact assessment can be done through AutoCase, it can be done through 3 pillars, it can even be done through an Excel spreadsheet. But however you do it, you got to crunch some numbers and then streamline. And then potentially go back through the stakeholder assessment. Sometimes you don't have to do that step. Some of the decisions that we've looked at, we've worked with the Japanese government to determine which biofuel projects they should support. We are currently looking right now at 4 different grants in Latin America to understand how they are changing livelihoods and social structure in Latin America and how it's changing immigration patterns. We also have looked at corporate investments, everything from whether or not to invest in an expensive pollution prevention device to acquisitions, building a new facility, expanding a facility. We worked with Rio Tinto in South Africa to determine whether or not they should invest more in HIV/AIDS education. And with Dow Chemical, every 10 years we work with them to determine which sustainability goals have the most bang for the buck. So I want to go through quickly the State Department project that we're working on. The U.S. State Department has offered a $500,000 grant to 4 Latin American organizations. These are organizations that have already proven that they have a solution in one region or target audience, and the grant is to help them expand that. There are 4 different pillars that they're focusing on. As I said, one of the things that they're really interested in is whether or not it's curbing immigration. Also looking at a number of other things, but that is one thing. But they want to know, are these good investments? And this is a kind of a pilot project for them. So I want to talk about one of them. It's called Kapia Maya Inakua. And this is a company in Guatemala. They have developed mesh greenhouses that in the Guatemalan climate, they reduce pesticide use. They produce dramatically higher crop yields. They're primarily focused on tomato growing. The company is an agricultural research center, and so Guatemalans eat tomatoes 3 times a day, so they started with those. They're also looking at other crop production. When they first won the grant, they had not yet gotten to fully organic production within the greenhouses. Since they've gotten the grant, they have actually developed that technology and are sharing that with the farmers that they're working with. The grant was used to basically facilitate the purchase of the mesh greenhouses. It's essentially used as a loan to the farmer so they can purchase the mesh greenhouse and then pay it back. With the money that they then pay it back, the company can now fund the next farmer to buy their greenhouses. So it's kind of a perpetuating project, which is pretty cool. As I said, for the project, the mesh greenhouses do offer tremendous yield increases. However, there is still a huge risk of crop failure. So we identified that as a huge risk for the project, that there was between a 5 and 25% risk of complete crop failure within a given year. But there were also opportunities for folks to export crops. And so that was a big opportunity that was identified. We did look at opportunities for the environment and future generations. So we looked at higher crop yields, and we used life cycle assessment to look at these higher crop yields and lower pesticide and fertilizer use. We also looked at lower runoff of pesticides and fertilizers. One of the reasons why this is so important here is because where the Vista Volcanis company is located, all of that pesticide and fertilizer runs into a volcano, and an extinct volcano, and so it has no place to go. They just sit there. On the negative side, we've got steel supports. Those contributed pretty poorly to the LCA, but as long as they have a nice long life and can be reused as we replace the mesh, that will keep that resource use down. During the workshop, we had 2 women from a women's cooperative there. They were both from an indigenous women's cooperative. Really interesting perspective from them. Indigenous people in Guatemala are not treated very well, and indigenous women are treated even worse. What they found from the use of these greenhouses was it brought income for women, which in turn brought them empowerment, self-esteem, which they they desperately needed. It allowed them to educate themselves. They were learning in the greenhouses, their children were learning in the greenhouses, but it also gave them funds to improve their children's education. They felt it brought family unity, and one thing that we were not able to quantify, unfortunately, was they felt it was changing societal values toward women, which was a pretty powerful thing to learn from this. I've got to go pretty quick here. Uh, this is the way we share our results because there is such a range of probability and because different stakeholders will have a different viewpoint on which end of the probability range they believe the results should be. So if I look at this bar here, the very light color is the full range of probability. The next darker color is the 90% probability range, and the dark color is the 50% probability range. Another reason why we do this is because often these tails, and especially if they go over the 0 mark, will definitely tell us, indicate to us that there's a scenario that we want to look at in more detail. So down at the bottom, we have the net present value. In this case, this is a 2-year net present value. So we can see for the farmers, they have great gross profits. That crop loss risk was huge, as is robbery and vandalism. But they have a possibility of actually getting those higher revenues per pound because they are either growing different crops or they're going organic. And here we look at the results for all the stakeholders. And here we can see everybody's on the positive side. We don't have to make adjustments to the project to get everybody on the positive side of the balance sheet. The producers are doing well. The environment is doing well. Vista Volcanis is not doing too badly. The municipalities are doing really well, and this has in turn encouraged them to invest in more of these greenhouses, so they've provided another grant. Women obviously doing well, and they are a subset of the producers, so when we look at everyone combined, they're taken back out. I'm going to go quickly I'm going to skip this next example so we can get to Terry's talk. Just want to let you know that we'll be talking a little bit more about this and sharing with you the 3 Pillars tool on January 12th. So I'd love to have you come and join us for that. You'll also have another chance to ask questions, which we'd love to have you do. So I'm going to turn it now over to Terry.
Great, thanks, Lisa. So that was, again, just like Steph, very informative, very helpful, I think, in the overall discussion. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Terry. And Terry, while you're getting situated, I just want to remind everyone to, if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and submit those through the chat menu using the chat with or send question to staff. That would be great, and we'll be leaving some time at the end to get through those.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim. Can you see my screen?
We can, thank you.
Okay, and you obviously hear me. So thank you all, and thank you for inviting me to share with you briefly our experience here at Pratt & Whitney with using sustainable return on investment. I'll go through a case study, but I just want to set the stage for you and let you know that Pratt & Whitney is a maker of aircraft engines, and within the past few years, Pratt & Whitney has developed and come out with what is considered a next generation engine that uses less than 15% fuel than the conventional engines, and also is 75% less noisy. So it's considered a game changer in the industry, and it supports the airline industry's sustainability initiatives. Pratt & Whitney is a company owned by United Technologies Corporation. And you see a quote here from our CEO of United Technologies that talks about the need to focus on innovation and sustainability into the future. So, you know, United Technologies really has this history of focusing on sustainability and driving down our environmental footprint at the factory level. So this is where sustainable return on investment, I think, could play a key role. So we started taking a look at this a few years ago, and one of the drivers was the need to bridge the sustainability goals that we have as a corporation with our financial expectations. And as many of you know, oftentimes those are in conflict, or at least appear to be in conflict. We also wanted to better capture the value of the sustainability projects that we undertake. And we recognize that in order to advance our sustainability goals, we needed to have projects which showed a strong business case. Finally, there are technical challenges that need to be addressed that sustainable return on investment approach does. These are associated with time horizons, complexity, and uncertainty. I think these are all the things that the tools that both the EarthShift Global as well as Impact Infrastructure incorporate into their methodologies. But there's also adaptive challenges that need to be addressed, and I'm going to speak to that just a little bit at the end of this presentation. So briefly, the approach for sustainable return on investment, as you've heard before, is you're taking the financial return on investment, the traditional financial return on investment, but you're adding through monetization the intangibles and the externalities that you identify. And so what the process that we undertook with EarthShift Global's help is to initially gather the stakeholders, which is really a critical piece, not only gathering the stakeholders, but making sure you have a strong facilitator to drive this process, to develop the problem statement, make sure it's a clear problem statement so that you know that what you're working on, and then develop your probabilities of occurrence through your stakeholder process. You assign cost ranges with your stakeholders, and then that gives you all the inputs that you need to perform your net present value statistical analyses. And then also you can perform a sensitivity analysis at the end to look at various alternatives. So I wanted to just present one example of how we've used this over the past few years to give you a better feel for this. So we looked at the economic feasibility of upgrading a chiller at a facility that we have. And the reason was that the chiller was an antiquated system. It's challenging to maintain due to the scarcity of parts and also the general lack of automation of the system. But we also recognized that there was future expansion that was going to occur at this facility, so the chiller system would be taxed at some point in the future. And the chiller system operates 24 hours, 7 days a week. It's used not only for cooling the facility, but also for cooling process units and for the IT data management center. So, of course, in many ways, it's a critical component. So we looked at several alternatives, which you see there, and the one I'm just going to focus on is upgrading with a new chiller system, which turned out to be the most beneficial using this approach. So what I'm showing you here is the output of the analyses that we conducted. We often evaluate our projects here at Pratt & Whitney, looking at simple payback models. So we're looking at the time it would take to regain our investment. And so we took the models that EarthShift Global had generated for us and translated those into something that could be used for communication purposes to our management. So you see the blue line there represents the financial return on investment only. And you can imagine this is why on its surface we had a hard time selling to management the need to upgrade this project. The red line represents the financial return on investment plus the intangibles that we identified through the stakeholder process. And those intangibles included, the impact of the chillers going down. As the system becomes more antiquated, the likelihood of that happening is greater and greater. The spare parts becoming more and more obsolete the older the system gets. The production impacts of the system going down, which turns out to be a major driver. This system is located in the south, and in the heat of the summer, it doesn't take long for cost to escalate as a result of the system going down. And then we also looked at worker impacts and maintenance ability. So the result of all of that was driving that cost curve up to a more reasonable a payback period using this approach. And then the final thing we looked at was, what if we were to identify the costs associated or the benefits associated with the greenhouse gas savings as a result of going to more efficient equipment. So we factored that in as well. And so you can see the result of this analysis shows that rather than this being a cost to the company, it could actually be a savings fairly quickly to the company. So the observations that I wanted to share from this approach was, first of all, upgrading the chiller was the most cost-effective of the options that we looked at. The facility management folks were very enthusiastic about the approach. The approach is actually similar to that used at Pratt & Whitney for other investment-making decisions, particularly on having to do with parts generation. And then there were other opportunities identified by the facility as a result of this. So all very favorable items. So the question is, why is this so hard to do? And it comes back to what I mentioned before, which is, the adaptive challenges. We know the technical challenges and solutions to those technical challenges. That's the area that EarthShift Global and Impact Infrastructure live in. But trying to bring this in to a manufacturing operation, it continues to be a challenge. So the classic error is diagnosing and treating these adaptive challenges, trying to bring this into the culture of the company as if they were technical problems. And I'd love to hear some of the reasons why those challenges are there, and they're real. They're things that we experience, and these are the kind of the long-term things that we need to be working on and continue to work on here at Pratt & Whitney. So the last thing I just wanted to leave you with was that I'm optimistic about this approach. I think the approach helps to facilitate this conversation of the bridge between the corporate values that we aspire to and the corporate goals that we have. I think sustainable return on investment helps us to facilitate that conversation. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you is something that Stefan had mentioned up front, is that there are others that are recognizing the value of using a sustainable return on investment approach to capture the triple bottom line, including the U.S. Green Building Council. You'll find this quote in the latest LEED Core Concepts guide. So with that, I think that's all I have.
Great, thanks, Terry. I'm going to let you catch your breath a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and take back control. And I want to start going through some of the questions that we have. And I want to say to the panelists that although most of these questions are directed at one particular speaker, feel free, if you have a comment or you have some additional information you'd like to share, feel free to jump in as well. But I think the first question, let's go with Steph. And here there's a question is, do you ever have pushback in terms of putting dollar values on environmental or social factors?
Yeah, definitely that is an occurrence on occasion. I would say well, my response to that when it does happen is usually that we are taking something that is very, by its nature, qualitative and subjective, and trying to make it as objective as possible. And so, instead of just dismissing things like water quality or recreational value or heat island effect or pollution, we're attempting to quantify its impact on an apples-to-apples basis with financial impact. So I do get that pushback. That's usually my response. I would say typically, often we don't get pushback, of course, but when we do, it's often engineers, I find. And I think the reason is because engineers, I would say engineers and finance people specifically, or accountants, because really those people, they're used to numbers being, they live and die by the numbers and equations, and everything's got to be, factored down to the 10th decimal point, which is great. I mean, that's what their job is. But the reality is that what we're trying to do is facilitate decision making, considering things that are often underrepresented or can't be considered in the decision-making process. So I do get that question pretty often, but I would say it's rarely a stumbling block, except with individuals who, their whole education and work experience drives them to want, proofs and extreme precision. But most other people are good with it.
Yeah, Jim, can I jump in on that one?
Yeah, oh, yeah, please.
Yeah. So, we get pushback, especially on putting value on human health. But if you consider that insurance companies put a value on human health every single day, then you can start to get people to understand that, yeah, you can put these numbers on things, and in fact, by doing so, you make them more valuable, if you will, if not less.
I agree.
Great. So the next question I'm going to throw over to you, Terry, if you've caught your breath now. You kind of went through a little bit of this during the discussion, but what would you say was the most challenging aspect that you find when using a sustainable return on investment approach?
Well, I think, aside from the adaptive challenges, I think the technical challenges that we were initially faced with was, at the end of the day, really trying to get comfortable with the approach. Certainly the stakeholder engagement process, making sure that we have the right stakeholders, that they are that they're there to be engaged to help solve a solution was a big challenge. And one of the things that we learned was that really to do the process justice, you got to have everyone in the same room at the same time and go through the whole thing pretty much at once. I mean, what we've tried to do the first few times here was find opportunities where people could get together, and it just didn't work. So, I think we have to respect the process, get everyone into the room, have a strong facilitator to make sure we're staying on track and focusing on the right things.
Excellent. So I'm going to kind of paraphrase this next question and just open it up to the entire panel. So the question is kind of piggybacks a little bit on what Steph and you, Terry, had just mentioned, and it really goes into how you quantify the dollar value with respect to keeping water quality good, reducing greenhouse gas, things like this. I know that we saw a little bit of that, Steph, in your presentation, so I think if you could just kind of step into that a little bit, just another level of detail, and maybe it's covered over in the next one, but I think you guys can probably put a little more detail on that.
Sure, maybe I can take a start, and I'm not sure Lisa probably might want to add to it again. But so we're using essentially the easiest way to think about it, and I had a slide there with a whole bunch of logos, on my section. And the easiest thing to think about is that the U.S. federal government does require cost-benefit analysis for a wide variety of things. Transportation is actually the sector where it is most widely used. So you've got things like Tiger grants or fast lane grants, which are giving out billions of dollars of competitive funds based on projects proving the cost-benefit analysis. Benefits, or the monetizing public benefits in the terms of environmental and social factors. And there's very explicit guidance on how to do that, in particular for the Tiger grant. We've done a lot of those, which I hadn't mentioned earlier, but so it's not really, it's not really that crazy how we're coming up with the values. I know Lisa mentioned earlier too that sometimes we can take stakeholder opinion and really, create values based on those, but it's not most of the time, and certainly with AutoCase, our software that does this automatically, we really try to eliminate any perception that the numbers, valuation of environmental social factors aren't very rigorous. In terms of doing a consulting project, there is certainly more flexibility to reflect values of the stakeholders specifically, but things like, the value of water, value of statistical life, value of carbon, value of criteria contaminants, those things are generally federal guidance that we follow from EPA or Department of Transportation that are very explicit in how to value these things. So there's not really, we're trying to make it as defensible as possible, especially on the software side. I want to emphasize that again, that our AutoCase software, we're really trying to be defensible on that. When we do a consulting project, I'm sure Lisa will agree, there's a little bit more flexibility in terms of reflecting local opinions or stakeholder opinions for things like, improved aesthetics or social equity or things like that. But especially with AutoCase, we try to be as transparently defensible as possible.
We kind of look at it just a tiny bit differently, that when we're trying to put a value system on, or put a value on something, we're trying to include everybody's value system. So if you look at climate change, for example, in the U.S., you've got folks that, they're not really on board, but even those, they can't argue with a market value. On the far end of the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are looking at it from a complete social perspective, and so they're looking at a much higher value. So we try and use that whole value range so that we show everybody's perspective. And then nobody can argue with the results because their value system is in there too. And I just want to give another example. We had, I was in Peru not long ago. We were looking at the value of reduced turnover to the employees. And we had the perspective of employees. We brought that in, and then we also brought in the perspective of their employers with the concept, well, it takes you 3 months to find another job. And there's a possibility that you won't make as much money as you did before. So those, we used, again, as Steph said, we used the value systems of the different stakeholders in the room. And again, we try and pull in a full range so that we include everybody's value system.
Great. Next question is for you, Lisa, so that's a good segue here. So it seems like the use of S-ROI is growing, and the question really is there a way to keep up to date with developments?
Great question. We have just launched with Impact Infrastructure, Steph and his team, a newsletter which is going to go out every 3 months, and you can jump on our website and sign up for it.
Excellent. Hopefully folks take advantage of that. The next question we'll throw back to Terry, and I think this kind of piggybacks on some of the earlier questions that we've been getting, which is how confident can you be in your answer when assigning values to items that are viewed as intangibles?
Yeah, I think that does kind of speak to what was mentioned earlier, and I think the only thing I could really add to what was discussed was, I guess, two perspectives. And one is that, you know, there's the perspective that if you approach it as if there's really no such thing as an intangible, that that you can assign values to the intangibles. The question is really how confident you are in the values that you assign. So the tools that that EarthShift has, and I'm sure Impact Infrastructure has, allows for ranges to be assigned, and it allows for probability of occurrence to be assigned, which is really a degree of belief in those numbers. So I think that's what's powerful about these tools, is that it allows you to you know, acknowledge that uncertainty within the tool itself.
Yep. Next question is, we'll look at, it's really interesting. So really the statement here is that, you know, are there guidelines to doing an S-ROI study? And the questioner says, for example, when you do an LCA study, there are ISO guidelines. Is there anything equivalent for S-ROI?
Not yet.
Something we can work on as the as the team, possibly. One of our goals, certainly with the EarthShift, is to add more standardization to S-ROI, and that's the kind of thing we might, you know, over time work on for sure.
Okay, and I think this is kind of sort of falls in line with that question as well. It's really to Lisa in regards to, is there or are there some more training available for S-ROI?
Another good question. We have got a boot camp coming up the week of April 3rd, in which we've got a day set aside for S-ROI facilitation training. We're also looking at adding a 3-hour course that we developed for the folks in Latin America. And so we're looking at bringing that here and probably doing that as an online course. So keep checking back to our website to find dates for that one.
Perfect. So another question that came in here, and I know folks. Oh.
Steph, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
No, I think that's good. I think we're at the hour too. Probably.
I was just going to say that we're right at the top of the hour here, so we have a few more questions. We can keep going. If folks feel like they need to drop to get to another meeting, totally understand. As we said, we'll be recording these responses as well as the overall session. So we'll go on for another couple minutes to pick off a few more of these questions, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up. So the next question is, and this I think speaks to you, Lisa, a little bit, but obviously back to Steph, and certainly with Terry's experiences. How do you get the stakeholders to converge on a value they all agree upon?
Oh, well, they don't have to. That's the beauty of it. And in fact, because they don't have to agree, because once a person says, that's never going to happen, and somebody else says, I think there's a 50% probability, when you can say to them, well, great, then we'll look at a probability range from 0 to 50%. You've just taken away the argument. They're not fighting anymore, and they start to work with you. They start to work with each other and try and figure out ways to make the decision the best decision. So it's really fascinating to watch that happen.
Yes, Steph, do you have anything or Terry, do you have anything to add to that?
I've seen it, many times as well, that, the range, the ability to put in a range of values really does allow people to feel like their opinions have been heard, even if they don't necessarily agree with sort of the common opinion or the median point of the value that's utilized. It's powerful to have people feel like their opinion is not being ignored but being reflected, even if it isn't heavily weighted in the process.
I would just add also that it's important that everyone buys into the process. So So there's a need maybe for some upfront education on the process itself. But once, if everyone buys into the process and the output, it's hard to argue with the output. And so I think that's what we try to do.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Terry. Yeah.
Okay, so hey, we're at the last question here, and it's to you, Steph, and I think it's something that we've talked a little bit about, and it really goes to, how might you go about measuring the incremental benefits, I guess, and/or costs of various design options?
Yeah, so I mean, you can look at, we do that often, is look at different design options on various projects. I mean, what I talked about earlier for Fort Bliss, for instance, you can see what your benefits and costs measured in dollars objectively compared to each other are of doing different things. So for instance, on a building, like I said, buildings on my mind from doing those, you might think, what do we want to do with our roof of this sustainable building? Well, you could build a green roof, you could build a blue roof, you could put solar panels on the roof, hot water heaters, rain collection cistern, some kind of combination of them. And so using the S-ROI process allows you to really compare those types of things on an apples-to-apples basis and see which one is better for your specific needs and for society around you. And things like the value of water, the makeup of the electrical grid, how dependent it is on fossil fuels, the amount of pollution produced per megawatt hour, et cetera. All that stuff gets considered in the decision making. And I just use a building example, but it could be other alternatives like what to do at a wastewater treatment plant in terms of the biogas produced. So for instance, do you clean up the gas and put it into the natural gas system as renewable natural gas? Do you use it for combined heat and power at the plant itself? Do you use it to power a local business that might be nearby? There's a lot of different options in terms of when you're designing a system, and this is a really great way to truly compare what is best. Similarly, when we were talking about LEED as an example earlier, or Envision, you can get a LEED point for doing something or an Envision point for doing something, but how do you know what the best bang for the buck is? Not just based on points, like this is worth 1 point, that's worth 1 point, but what's the true benefit of one investment versus another? So that's really a powerful use of S-ROI.
Oh, yeah. I think that's a great example and a great way to sort of wrap this up. And thank you, Terry and Stefan and Lisa, for your commentary and very interesting presentations. I'm going to put in a couple plugs for some upcoming webinars, those of you who stayed on. As Steph had said, on December 15th at 1 p.m. he'll be going through the triple bottom line business case using the AutoCase software. So feel free to go to earthshift.com or earthshiftglobal.com, /brownbag to register for that one. And then on January 12th, we've got Lisa's coming to walk you through 3 pillars and, again, get into more of the nitty-gritty, if you will, in doing one of these assessments. So I want to thank everyone for their time today. Again, we'll be recording this session and putting it up on the website to review later and or share with your colleagues. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye.
You too.